and it's a pleasure to have Peter Lythe with us, all the way from Welwyn Garden City in darkest Hertfordshire. Peter is undertaking a doctorate at the Bentham Project, unfortunately for him, under my supervision, and working on Bentham's religious writings. He has a scholarship from the London Arts and Humanities Partnership. And just a little bit of background on Bentham's religious writings. Bentham published three, or rather I should say there were three texts of Bentham's published during his lifetime. The first one was Church of Englandism and its Catechism Examined, which came out in 1818 and consisted in a criticism of the, well, ostensibly the Church of England's religious practices, and argued that there should be no test for no religious test for education. And Peter's written about that subject in his thesis. It's going to form one chapter. The second work came out in 1822, which was an analysis of the influence of natural religion on the temporal happiness of mankind. And that work was edited by George Grote from Bentham's manuscripts. The manuscripts in question are now in the Grote papers in the British Library. When Bentham died, he gave the papers to Harriet Grote, George Grote's wife. There are about 1,500, 1,600 folios, headed Juggernaut, which was Bentham's scathing title for religion. And they're a fascinating resource, really not at all explored. They were only transcribed for the first time a few years ago by Catherine Fuller, and I've done some work on them, revising the transcripts, but not done a great deal in terms of putting them into order. The relationship between Grote's analysis and Bentham's manuscripts is somewhat tenuous, and I did originally thought that, or we did originally thought that Grote had taken his text from Bentham's manuscripts, but rather he was more inspired by Bentham's manuscripts. And so you can hardly find a match-up between any sort of sentence in Bentham's manuscript and the analysis. The third work was Not Paul But Jesus, which came out in 1823 and seems to have been much more faithfully edited by Francis Place, Bentham's friend. And that, as it states, is ostensibly a comparison of the doctrines of Jesus as opposed to those of Paul, and Bentham making the claim that Paul had his own religion. The volume, which was published, and it's a hefty volume and consists of a very close reading of the Acts and the epistles of Paul, was only the first volume of 3 projected volumes. The third volume, which was relatively short, I edited and was published on the Bentham Project website a few years ago. The second volume is in manuscript. That was transcribed in the first instance by Catherine Pease Watkin, or Catherine Atkinson, and then I did quite a lot of work on that in trying to put it into order. But that means there's the Juggernaut manuscripts and the Not Paul But Jesus manuscripts, which are pretty much unknown, have only recently been transcribed, and it's on that Peter has been working, and we'll hear some of the fruits of his research today. So I hope that's all right, Peter. Maybe repeating some of the things you were going to say at the beginning, but I thought for our people who aren't familiar with Bentham's religious manuscripts, it might help just to give a bit of background. So anyway, without me going on any longer, I think it's time to hand over to you and to listen to your paper. So thanks, Peter.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to flag up a couple of things before I start. First of all, when I introduce a quote from Bentham, I'll flag up that I'm doing so. But there are several grabbed quotes and interesting turns of phrase that are Bentham's throughout my paper, and it would just break up the flow to flag up each one of these. So if people notice any kind of rhetorical flourishes or interesting arcane turns of phrase, they'll be Bentham's, not mine. The second thing I wanted to point out is that in addition to talking about Bentham and Paul, I also talk about the historian, and this person is Bentham's turn of phrase, or Bentham's name, for the person who wrote the Acts of the Apostles. Bentham refers to this person as the historian, or the historiographer, the biographer throughout not Paul but Jesus. But I'll just refer to him as the historian throughout. So, to start, not Paul but Jesus represented a significant advancement in Bentham's strategy to undermine religion in general and to subvert the authority of revealed religion in particular, in that his evaluation of an important part of the biblical canon in terms of its utility was allied to an explicit challenge to the idea that it proclaimed the truth. That challenge comprised two fundamental assertions. First, that the religion masquerading as Christianity was not truly and substantively Christian, in that it did not correspond to the religion that, according to the authors of the Gospels, had been revealed to mankind by Jesus. And second, that the claims of this substitute Christianity were largely and designedly untrue. Bentham's thesis was that authentic Christianity had been deliberately perverted by the false doctrines of the man who, in the years immediately following Jesus' death, had sought to establish himself as the leader of the burgeoning Christian community. In other words, the ostensible religion of Jesus, the religion that went by the name of Christianity, was really the religion of Paul. Bentham set out to sweep away the harmful and dishonest teachings of Paul so that only the religion of Jesus, properly conceived, would be left to religionists to do with as they pleased, and left to Bentham to take as his final target in his offensive against religion. As Philip said, Bentham composed the material for Not Paul but Jesus between 1816 and 1823. Despite his intention to publish the work in 3 volumes, only the first volume, which appeared under the pseudonym Gamaliel Smith, was published in his lifetime. Central to these writings was an almost line-by-line analysis of the Acts of the Apostles and the Epistles of St. Paul, and Bentham's forensic testing of these major parts of New Testament scripture led him to conclude that Paul had been a liar, a hypocrite, and a fraud, whose enterprise was nothing more than one of personal ambition. Far from being in a receipt of a special commission from Jesus, as the self-constituted apostle and self-attested interpreter of God's will maintained, Paul had calculated that by becoming the leader of the followers of Jesus, he could obtain the wealth, power, and reputation that he craved. Paul's strategy had been to preach a religion, one of his own invention but bearing Jesus' name, that was ungrounded in evidence, so that his followers might develop a proneness to believe extraordinary things simply because he declared them to be true. So this paper will examine the means by which Bentham believed Paul had advanced that strategy, and thereby given to his scheme of personal ambition the greatest prospect of success. Paul's method had been to draw from 2 different but closely related sources of insincerity. The first was the mass of miracles that he had allegedly performed, or else benefited from, each of which appeared to Bentham to have had invention rather than powers supernaturally conferred by God for its cause. It will be shown that Bentham considered the inculcation of faith in the abstract, or blind credulity, an essential component of the teachings of a man who had known that to purchase an acceptance of deception was to deliver men's minds bound into the hands of interested and predatory impostors. The second comprised the forms of intellectual weakness and inaptitude of style, in a word, the nonsense, that Paul had deliberately employed in his letters. That's the epistles. It will be argued that Bentham thought the deluge of nonsense that was Pauline scripture formed not an obstacle, but an efficient and even a necessary aid to people's accepting the religion of Paul. By focusing his critique of Paul always upon the means by which he advanced his worldly enterprise, Bentham intended to reveal the fraud of Paul's ministry and further undermine the claims to credence made for both the epistles and the Acts. It will be argued that Bentham wanted to expose Paul's disingenuousness, but more than that, he wanted to demonstrate how, from Paul's perspective, a commitment to insincerity had been not a weakness, but the great strength of his strategy. It will also be demonstrated that this approach allowed Bentham to bring into sharper focus the connection that he identified between the exertions of Paul and those of Paul's successors in the ecclesiastical establishment. So, before he proceeded to assess the miracles attributed to Paul, Bentham attempted to give the word miracle a comprehensible meaning. A miracle, he said, was any occurrence which, supposing it correctly reported, was regarded by the reporting author as miraculous in its nature. It is worth noting that this apparently circular definition did not explicitly signify an occurrence that was miraculous as a matter of fact, but only one that seemed miraculous as a matter of subjective human perception. This was an inescapable consequence of Bentham's materialist worldview and his twofold assumption that, first, the material world existed, and second, a man's sense experience was the only way in which accurate information could be obtained about it. While the reporting author's sense perceptions might be faulty, or the information required to understand those perceptions lacking, the consequences of his accepting the evidence of sense were incomparably better than those of his rejecting it, because no matter how unreliable the sensory evidence was, it remained the only kind of evidence available. From Bentham's materialist perspective, the very notion of a supernatural intervention in the natural world was incoherent. Attributing a supernatural cause to an event in the natural world, which was the only world that anyone did or could know anything about, was a contradiction in terms. If something happened in the natural world, then by definition it could only have happened naturally. And man's inescapable reliance on the evidence of sense to ground all claims of knowledge meant that no man had the means to assert otherwise. Bentham's idea of a real miracle, therefore, did not so much betray an acknowledgement that miracles actually or necessarily existed in the world, as allow for the fact that in the presence or absence of certain conditions, certain occurrences appeared miraculous to certain people. That said, the main reason that Bentham issued the definition was so that he could contrast a quote, real miracle with two other phenomena, the false miracle and the quasi-miracle. A false miracle was an occurrence which, without imputing any dishonesty to the reporting author, could not be deemed miraculous. It was a natural event that relied entirely upon natural causes for its explanation. The author was simply mistaken in attributing the miraculous to the mundane. More significant was Bentham's notion of a quasi-miracle. As with a false miracle, a quasi-miracle was a non-miraculous event, but here the reporting author contrived to give the occurrence the appearance of a miracle, even though he did not think it miraculous. It was a miracle made out of a way of speaking by means of one or more ambiguous expressions used in the description of it. Bentham referred to any word or phrase to which so convenient a species of ambiguity adheres as a double entendre of the spiritual as opposed to the more conventional carnal kind. The originator of these spiritual double entendres, the deceiver, could be someone who had related the quasi-miracle to the reporting author, but it was more natural, argued Bentham, to suppose that the author himself had applied the requisite false gloss. The more frequently that quasi-miracles appeared in a given narrative, and the more plainly that the false gloss put upon them seemed conducive to some common end, the stronger the ground for thinking them the work of artifice rather than inadvertence. Bentham's thesis was that this ground had presented itself in the Acts. Bentham considered the manufacture of quasi-miracles to have been the historian's response to the inherent flaw in the false miracle. Although Bentham thought that an occurrence falsely reported as miraculous needed to be notorious in its nature if it was to support a religion, he also believed that the more notorious the miraculous occurrence seemed, and the more details that were given about it, the greater the likelihood of the falsity being detected. The characteristic property of a quasi-miracle, however, was that its falsity could not be exposed to detection, because the discourse used to describe the occurrence possessed not one but two senses. Crucially, these senses represented the occurrence as miraculous and non-miraculous at the same time, or rather as alternately miraculous and non-miraculous as the historian required. The more the miraculous first sense was accepted as true, the more fully and effectually the historian's purpose had been served. In the event, however, that any man did not receive the occurrence as miraculous, that same occurrence remained capable of being understood according to the non-miraculous second sense embedded in the discourse. If, for example, a reader failed to accept the idea of a miraculous vision, then instead of imputing falsity to the text and mendacity to the historian, He received the occurrence as a natural event, a dream perhaps, or a figment of the imagination. While the vision lost its probative force when divested of its miraculous character in this way, the historian's reputation for probity remained intact. The reader of the Acts was told, for example, that Paul had been bound in the Spirit to go to Jerusalem, while on another occasion it was through the Spirit that Paul had refrained from travelling to the city. Rather than stating plainly and simply that Paul had or had not gone to Jerusalem and giving reasons why, the historian employed the useful word spirit without saying anything about whether it referred to a supernatural entity or merely Paul's prevailing mood. Bentham observed that at so small a price, the historian created a verbal miracle that in mind suitably disposed was welcome to improve into a real one. The form as well as the function of the quasi-miracle was similar to that of the vision asserted by implication. This was Bentham's name for an intimation more or less obscure of an uncontextualized exchange between Paul and the Almighty, as suggested by the phrases attributed to Paul, such as, "The Lord commanded me," or "The Lord comforted me." The historian's object in reporting that Paul had seen the Spirit at Mysia, which suffered him not to enter the region of Bithynia, was nothing more than to furnish Paul with an ostensibly supernatural reason for not setting foot in a place that he had no desire to visit. It would be of little use, said Bentham, to collect all the passages in which visions of this complexion may be found. All employed the same commodious phrases, all wore the same character of convenience. Whereas a vision directly stated had the disadvantage of calling attention to a fact whose existence an inquisitive mind might find reason to doubt, an indirectly stated vision bore no such weakness, because the supernatural element had only been insinuated. If the reader accepted that Paul had held a conversation with the Almighty, then this was a miracle to swell the catalogue of evidences in favour of Paul's claims. If he thought the words a manner of speaking about an ordinary event, well then this was an effusion of piety deserving of praise. No better bargain, declared Bentham, could ever be made. All through the Acts, Bentham saw the most ordinary occurrences metamorphosed into miracles by the operation of a loose word or two. Whereas Paul, by his own account, had one day embraced a sleeping youth called Eutychus, the historian reported that the youth had been taken up dead by Paul, who then reassured his disciples that life is in him. The historian had thereby sketched an outline for the imagination of the reader to fill. And so it was, said Bentham, that Paul had been able to acquire the reputation of raising a man from the dead and make, quote, so brilliant an addition to the catalogue of his miracles. Another type of quasi-miracle to which Bentham drew attention was the miracle unparticularized, whose usefulness to the historian, and therefore to Paul, lay in its being completely detection-proof. An unparticularized miracle, as Bentham defined it, was an occurrence which the author of the Acts attempted to designate as miraculous, without specifying any circumstances capable of directing the reader to the really existing objects of time, place, people, and things. In the absence of these details, the occurrence could not of itself appear false, nor could it be shown to be false. Unparticularized miracles never appeared in isolation, but arrived in sets or multitudes of indeterminate quantity under some such expletive phrase as signs and wonders. Again, the great advantage of employing this sort of expression, thought Bentham, was that it left the number, shape, colour, and duration of the miraculous occurrences always to the imagination and thence to the gratification of the reader. And this is a longer quote from Bentham. To him whose organs are sufficiently prepared for the swallowing of everything presented to him in the form of a miracle, these are miracles. To him whose swallow is not capacious enough to pass a miracle unless it be particularized, it is nothing more than, in the spiritual career, a progress so rapid as to be wonderful. Using the metaphor of a gardener liberally scattering his seeds, Bentham observed that among the various kinds of rhetorical flour strewn throughout the Acts, signs and wonders sprang up at every turn. This and phrases like it appeared without any explanation, so that in case of falsity or incorrectness in circumstance, there was nothing of substance to refute. If linguistic allusions such as these counted as proof, reasoned Bentham, then there existed no form of imposture to which proofs could ever be wanting. In that regard, he noted how the ecclesiastical establishment followed the historian's example and made abundant use of quasi-miracles, largely for the purpose, in their case, of reaping the praise of piety. Bentham alleged that quasi-miracles were in constant exercise in the Church of England, filling the Catechism and the other literary works of the Church. Whatever wrongs were done in human life, the clergy invoked a supernatural being called Satan to bear the shame of it. Whatever good, God, in one or other of his persons, was invited to claim the merit and the glory of it. Yet Bentham argued, nothing real was ever lost or gained by this spiritual traffic, except insofar as any word of praise that a priest offered up to the Almighty reliably fell back upon the clergyman with the conjunct merits and glories of piety and humility close cleaving to it. Bentham thought that not only was the language of the Acts in a most convenient degree well adapted to the fabrication of quasi-miracles, but that an extraordinary facility had been given to the spread of the deception by the English translation of the Bible, as interpreted and enforced by the clergy of the English Church. Whereas the text in its original form presented a sort of option between a quasi-miracles, miraculous and non-miraculous sense, the authorized King James Version often permitted none but the miraculous connotation. Bentham's view was that the lay religionists of his own time were made to receive certain words in an exclusively miraculous sense, even in cases where the historian appeared not to have expected or intended his readership to understand his words other than in a natural sense. One example was the word angel, which religionists were enjoined to take always in a supernatural sense, despite the term being a mistranslation of the Greek for messenger. In Bentham's assessment, the historian's description of the angel who visited the centurion Cornelius as a man in bright clothing betrayed the true import of the word. Bentham was convinced that many of the quasi-miracles crafted on behalf of Paul had subsequently been translated into ostensible real miracles. The result was that no matter how false and inauthentic the original Acts was, both as a historical record and as a statement of the religion of Jesus, its falsehoods were compounded and its language rendered still less authentic in the very work that the religionists of Bentham's day revered as authoritative sacred scripture. Bentham argued that Paul could not have founded a religion without first appropriating to himself the name of Jesus, then building the false superstructure of his own religion upon the groundwork that Jesus had laid. Part of that effort had entailed turning to his own account 12 directly stated miracles, each of which had involved a manifestation of almighty power exercised through or for the apparent benefit of Paul. If taken together, said Bentham, then a man who lacked the accurate conception of the probative form of evidence to which maturer ages have given birth might consider these miracles proof of Paul's alleged commission from God. If considered separately, however, then it was no more possible to ignore the deficiencies common to each miracle than it was to view the man to whom God had supposedly imparted extraordinary powers as anything other than an impostor intent on giving support to a lucrative system of deception. Although Bentham granted that there was no evidence to suggest that the 12 occurrences had been without some foundation in fact, that was beside the point. His concern was not with the actuality of each occurrence, but with its probable cause and the probable purpose for which it had been recorded. Alerting his own readership to the inadequacy of the historian's accounts of directly stated miracles, even when evaluated on their own terms, Bentham made the following observation about the credence that ought reasonably to be given to these accounts. There was, he said, an immensely wide difference between the probative force of a miracle that a man had witnessed himself and one that a man knew nothing about except for what he had read in a work of a centuries-dead author would fail to explain anything of the unintelligible or ambiguous material that comprised his reports. Irrespective of how persuasive a witness to a supposed miracle had found the supposed miracle worker's claim to be in receipt of a special commission from God, no equal conviction could be afforded to a written statement of that miracle. This was especially true in circumstances where no elucidation could be obtained from the author of the statement, or where the author appeared, from all else that was known of him, to belong to that class of beings called liars. Bentham argued by way of a hypothetical personal example that even if he were told of a wonder in a letter from an acquaintance in whom he had complete confidence, if all possibility of elucidation had been excluded, then he would be unable to give any credence to the claim. Bentham's resolute scepticism on this point, as on all else, was grounded in his empiricism, and the supreme value that he placed upon sense experience as the basis of man's knowledge of the world. On the one hand, he declared, the sort of facts asserted would be inconsistent with everything I have ever seen or heard of the established course of nature. On the other hand, even if the acquaintance had been no liar, every human being is, at one time or another, on some material point or another, deficient in correctness. The fact that Bentham thought all men occasionally mistaken in their observations, judgments, recollections, and beliefs was uncontroversial, but the first part of his reasoning requires further comment. The extraordinary images impressed upon Bentham's imagination by one nameless and seemingly untrustworthy historian, whose death prevented him from attempting to justify his claims, could not balance in the scale of probative force the collection of impressions and ideas that Bentham himself had derived from his own sense perceptions. He therefore saw no reason to endeavour to explain these images using any method other than the one that was universally accepted in all fields of human thought and action, except the religious. This common sense method entailed the adoption of that mode of accounting which seemed most probable and most conformable to the ordinary course of nature, as determined by man's own experience and observation. Bentham alluded to the features of this method throughout Not Paul But Jesus, but it was in the context of his discussion of Paul's directly stated miracles that he referred to it as the rule of greatest probability, which he defines as follows. Whatever effect may, with probability be referred to and accounted for by natural causes, for the accounting of it, forbear to have recourse to any cause of a supernatural cast, to any cause by the existence of which, in that character, if admitted, the effect in the event or state of things would be referred to the class of miraculous ones. Bentham argued that none of the claims to truth made for Paul's directly stated miracles could survive application of the rule of greatest probability. However, after setting out what he thought was the most probable explanation of each directly stated miracle, Bentham did not, strictly speaking, apply the rule himself. Rather, he left it for his prospective reader, the contemporary religionist, to do so instead. Bentham, in other words, provided his readership with a natural explanation of the supposedly supernatural event, even as he wanted people to think and decide for themselves what the probable true cause of the event had been. By juxtaposing his proffered natural explanation with the miraculous explanation preferred by the Church, Bentham forced his readers to confront the relative reasonableness, as he saw it, of an account which made no reference to the interposition of divine agency. On Paul's invocation of the hand of the Lord to blind the sorcerer Elymas, for example, the reader, said Bentham, was faced with two possibilities. Either the author of nature had sanctioned a suspension of the universal laws of nature to no other assignable end than the conversion of the Roman official who witnessed the event, or Elymas, who shared an indissoluble bond of connection with his fellow Jew and fellow impostor Paul, had kept his eyes shut. Similarly, on Paul's curing of the cripple at Lystra, Bentham pointed out that in an age so fertile in imposture, the occasion had only needed a vagrant to act a part for a few pence. Bentham's main complaint was that it was all too easy for the historian to employ the word cripple, but all too impossible, in an evidential sense, for any reader to contradict the falsity and thus naturalize the miracle. This asymmetry between the bare assertions that religionists were meant to take as proof of miraculous agency and the lack of direct evidence sufficient to refute those claims was reflected in the loose and uncircumstantial narrative of the unnamed man whom Paul, at some unstated time and place, had supposedly cured of a fever. While Bentham noted that it was far from inconceivable that the fever, as with so many other fevers, had departed of its own accord, the historian presented it as incontrovertible that God had gone to the effort of channeling a miracle through Paul for the treatment of a common human ailment. With all of these examples, Bentham was asking his reader the same essential question. Why accept a supernatural explanation of phenomena that supposedly occurred in the natural material world, when, with far greater probability of truth, a natural material explanation was available? Bentham's contempt for the historian was never less disguised when the disparity between the miraculous flavour given to a story and the natural explanation that Bentham thought it warranted was especially marked. The alleged miracle at Philippi, by which Paul had escaped from prison after an earthquake caused his shackles to loosen, was one such instance. Bentham found no necessary connection between the earthquake and Paul's liberation. The only logical conclusion to draw from the evidence in Bentham's view was that Paul had been freed by wholly natural means, perhaps as a result of his employing the facility and promptitude of his mind to cause the jailer to believe that God had sent the earthquake for keeping so holy a person incarcerated. Paul had then told his historian of what happened, colouring his narrative with no want of the marvellous, and the result was an account in the Acts of an ingenious earthquake that with nicety of touch had performed the office of a picklock. It had done so, remarked Bentham, despite the fact that earthquakes were no more able to let feet out of stocks or release hands from handcuffs than make watches. While the use of miracle stories represented the most conspicuous example of the sacrifice that Paul had made of his sincerity in the pursuit of self-interest, it was not the only example that Bentham brought to view. The more he examined the epistles, the more his distrust of Paul's sincerity increased. That distrust was aroused, however, not so much by the nature of Paul's truth claims themselves, as by the peculiar character of his writings. Bentham was clear in his view that when casting judgment on the aptitude of style in any ancient discourse, the one proper object of reference or standard of comparison belonged to the state of things as it manifests in these our times. By this he meant that whatever would be considered unapt in terms of the trustworthiness or linguistic fitness of a discourse written in the modern day was similarly unapt in a discourse written in the past. When assessing that aptitude, the reader needed only to ask himself whether, in the light of how well or ill adapted the ancient statement or narrative was to the known and indisputable purposes of language, the discourse would have any title to credence if delivered in the present. If the statement or narrative possessed no title to credence, then the fact of its having been delivered at an earlier time, even at a time when it had obtained credence, did nothing to confer such a title. It followed that any passages in Paul's epistles that a reader would think nonsensical if they had been written in the modern age were no less nonsensical for having been written in the past. Paul's epistles, alleged Bentham, were a tissue of paradoxes and palpable absurdities. In no other work could one find such an enormous and perpetually recurring abuse of words, such plump and wanton and close situated and ostentatious self-contradictions. In short, such antithetical, rambling, incoherent and tautologous nonsense. Bentham used the word nonsense as a generic appellative to describe a particular imperfection, an assemblage of words in which no proposition conveying any determinate import applicable to the subject in hand, and clear or capable of being made clear of obscurity, can be made out. The figurative trash that filled Paul's letters had passed, not merely for common sense, but for matter superior to common sense, which supposedly enlightened clergymen and religious commentators had converted into a foundation for an elaborate body of doctrine. Bentham saw no reason to presume that revelation had been the efficient cause of any of it. When even the simplest of mankind could speak plain sense without miraculous assistance, the idea that nonsense was the special production of the divine struck him as highly improbable. Although any author might accidentally introduce errors into a discourse, perhaps through carelessness or confusion, no such explanation could apply to speech or writings produced under the guidance of omniscience. Nothing in Bentham's view was more suitable and favourable to improbity in the field of religion than purposed obscurity. Just as physical obscurity was the safeguard of the robber, so verbal obscurity was the natural refuge of the false prophet. Without exposing himself to detection, the false prophet could hazard whatever appeared to him conducive to his dishonest purpose, no matter how unsafe it would be to expound in plain language. The conclusive presumption, as far as Bentham was concerned, was that responsibility for the verbal obscurity that constituted the epistles belonged to the false prophet Paul and to Paul alone. Bentham declared that to exhibit all of the nonsense in the epistles, nonsense that had overwhelmed the fields of religion and morality, would be to transcribe almost the entirety of Paul's works. He chose instead to focus upon those forms of nonsense that he considered most harmful, the worst of which was the self-contradictory proposition. Of all the kinds of evidence by which falsehood can be detected or absurdity proved, said Bentham, a self-contradictory proposition stands at the head. This was a statement comprised of two opposite propositions, so expressed that if one were true, the other must be false. It was, in other words, an assertion that contained a denial of the self-same assertion in the same breath. Examples included reference to the compositeness of the uncompounded Godhead, which is Trinitarianism, and the claim that one and the same object, the bread of the Eucharist, was eaten and not eaten at the same time, which is a reference to transubstantiation. What, one may ask, was Paul's purpose in producing self-contradictory propositions? If Paul had a determinate object in view, how could such nonsense be rendered subservient to the attainment of it? Real instruction, answered Bentham, applied to the judicial faculty. In order to convey real instruction, nothing less than an entire proposition sufficed. Paul's business, however, had not been with the reason, but with the passions, in particular, the passions of fear and hope. Paul had recognized that he could set those passions to work simply by making use of words that were cloaked in verbal obscurity. If mention of heaven and hell excited the agony of fear and the ecstasy of hope, respectively, then it was irrelevant that no sentence comprised of these words made any sense. Paul had predicated many of his self-contradictory propositions on these and other kinds of opposite qualities: life and death, folly and wisdom, exaltation and depression, righteousness and unrighteousness, because they did not require any groundwork to be laid in solid sense. Drenched in nonsense, said Bentham, these words raised their heads above the deluge. Paul's use of loaded terms, and whatever self-contradictory phrases were formed from them, has contributed greatly to the production in men's minds of a most intense and consequently a most irritable persuasion or belief. By employing nonsensical discourses to arouse men's most intense hopes and fears, Paul had sought to instill credulity in his followers, so that as they placed absolute faith in him, he could exact absolute obedience from them. More specifically, Paul had tried to cultivate an indiscriminate acceptance of the persuasion that the doctrines he preached expressed the will of God. Instrumental to this process had been his relentless promotion of what Bentham called cacodemonism, i.e. the portrayal of the Almighty as a being of the most terrific and unfathomable kind. As the force of Paul's influence upon his followers had depended upon the degree of God's formidableness, so his ability to exert that influence in the furtherance of his own ends had depended on the utter incomprehensibility of God as the distributor of the posthumous rewards and punishments. Hence, although it was that an unfathomable being would dispense the ultimate pleasures and pains, which so excited men's hopes and fears, Paul had positioned himself as the interpreter of that being's will. If then men were to avoid the punishments and enjoy the rewards, they simply needed to do what he told them. According to Bentham, Paul's strategy to undermine the unbiased operation of the judgment had also involved investing faith with merit, to the effect that the more faith a man had, the more meritorious he was deemed to be. Since no merit could be attached to the holding of beliefs grounded in appropriate evidence, faith, in Paul's sense, had been persuasion or belief despite or even without appropriate evidence. In Bentham's view, however, judging against or in the absence of evidence was no less demonstrative of credulity than it was of outright foolishness. Self-contradictory propositions still acted upon the judgment as ostensible evidence, but it was upon the affections and the passions that they operated by sympathy. Only in this way, posited Bentham, could the requisite intensity of persuasion be produced in minds to which Paul's language was otherwise unintelligible. Far from being obstructive, then, it was Bentham's view that nonsense was in a high degree conducive, even necessary, to the production of the effect intended, namely the inculcation of credulity. Thus it was precisely to the degree to which Paul's words made no discernible sense that the end he had in view could be achieved. The employment of nonsense not only helped to produce the required persuasion, but it was also by the nonsensicality of the propositions that the persuasion was protected against all danger of being removed. If there was no nonsense in Paul's arguments, then the weakness of any one argument would be exposed to refutation. Where nonsense was an essential property of the discourse, however, it remained altogether refutation-proof, because just as no true conceptions could be attached to the words, no erroneous conceptions could be shown to be attached to them either. The nonsensicalness of Paul's epistles had helped to generate an intensity of persuasion that the very same nonsense was able to preserve. Anticipating the objection of the modern religionist that Paul had exhibited not nonsense or absurdity masquerading as eloquence, but simply ideas that were hard to understand, Bentham contended that such a claim implied that the subject matter was at least capable of being understood in the first place. The property of Paul's discourses that had tormented and confounded the minds of multitudes of unhappy religionists was not the difficulty, but the incapacity of their being understood. As one religionist found one import in a sequence of words, so a second religionist found an entirely different import in the same sentence, even when neither import was true. The only sensible question that anyone could ask when faced with examples of Paul's nonsense was, what determinate ideas were in the mind of Paul associated to these same words? To which Bentham's recurring answer was, neither this nor that, but none at all. Bentham also discovered that the forms of argumentation through which Paul had delivered his indeterminate ideas were themselves nonsensical and invariably specious. While the correct forms of argumentation were given throughout the epistles, the essence and character of proper argument was nowhere to be found. The reader was informed, for example, that Abraham had been saved by his faith without having been circumcised, therefore so might anybody else. Arguments like this were fallacious, bald assertions and non sequiturs presented as logic. Paul had also employed the argument from authority in a most commodious fashion. This was another fallacy in which an authority was cited as proof of the conclusion of the argument, without the author offering any other supporting evidence. As Bentham pointed out, it allowed any one thing to be demonstrated as conclusively as any other. An author could open any book and read on until something was found, which, if predicated on the subject he had in mind, would suit his purpose. Bentham referred to an example in Paul's letter to the Romans, in which the sinfulness of the Jews and the Gentiles was proved by a passage taken from the Psalms. Of Paul's argumentation, the main purpose and aim, concluded Bentham, had been to satisfy all concerned that, and this is a quote, so long as they paid obedience to such mandates as he, making use of the name of Jesus, should deliver, they neither need nor ought to pay any regard to the Mosaic law, and for designating the state of mind by which such obedience was ensured, faith was the term appointed by him. I think I'll just finish with this last bit. From the first to the last of his epistles, that sole object had never been out of Paul's sight. The faith in question, however, had been not to God, but to himself. Paul had emphasized in his writings that through the bargain God made with Moses, the Almighty had offered men only a small chance of attaining salvation at the high price of doing works, by which, noted Bentham, Paul had meant the rites and ceremonies of the Mosaic law. To perform enough of these burdensome works was an extremely precarious matter, not least because the quantity of work sufficient to attain salvation was unknown. Paul's offer, however, had been to say to his actual and prospective disciples that God was now operating through him, a specially commissioned emissary of Jesus and the interpreter of the will of the Almighty, in order to, quote, give to all who will accept of it, not a mere chance of salvation, but an absolute certainty of it. And that on so easy a condition, simply to believe all that he had to say and to do exactly as he told them. And I'll leave it there, if that's okay.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Peter. Yeah, I'm just getting a little bit of feedback on my sound. Just turn that down. First of all, just to say that if you'd like to ask a question, please just say so in the meeting chat. You can find the meeting chat on the bar that comes up when you put your mouse over the screen, and it's sort of the third one from the left where it says show conversation, and if you click that, then on the right hand side there's a space where you can type a message, and you can either write your question there or just say I've got a question to ask, and then you're welcome to turn on your mic and your camera if you wish. But just to say, we are recording, so if you don't want to be recorded, then just stay quiet. And the second thing before we move on, just to remind you that in 2 weeks' time we'll have our third seminar when David Lieberman will be speaking on an aspect of Bentham's later constitutional theory. and that will be at the same time, 5 p.m. UK time, 10 a.m. for David in California, in 2 weeks' time. And the breaking news is that we have another seminar, which will be in, well, I'm hoping there'll be one in 4 weeks' time as well, but we've got to organise that yet. But there will definitely be one in 6 weeks' time, and when we'll be having a sort of an online book launch for the Bentham and the Arts book, which is due out on the 11th of May. That is breaking news because the contributors to the volume don't know yet. Though our headline speaker will be Anthony Julius. So I hope everyone's okay with that information. So if you've got any questions, as I say, please just flag it up and I'll bring you in, and at an appropriate point. I just want to start off and just get Peter to expand a little bit and say, I mean, you've talked about Bentham's critique of Paul on miracles and on nonsense, but there's sort of a lot more to it as well, isn't there? I mean, you sort of covered, you know, very clearly those two parts, but there's more in the manuscripts where Bentham talks about other aspects of Paul's career. So I don't know if you just give us a bit more context.
Yeah, I guess the main omission, if you like, or the main thing that you would need to understand if you were going to look at Bentham's criticisms of Paul further, was what the actual doctrines were themselves that Bentham was alleging Paul was responsible for. So I've talked about almost the way in which he presented those doctrines through the nonsensicality of his discourses, and then talked about the miracles, but not actually what the central plank of those doctrines was. And this was the asceticism that Bentham refers to throughout Not Paul but Jesus, particularly in volume 3. So basically he accuses Paul of advancing a doctrine which he calls asceticism, which he sees as corrupting the religion of Jesus, because Jesus said nothing about asceticism. On the contrary, he alleges that Jesus shows, if you look at the gospel evidence, there's evidence to suggest that Jesus was perfectly comfortable with the pleasures of the table, dining with his friends a lot, even the pleasures of the bed, and he makes reference to the relationship that Jesus may have had with Mary Magdalene and possibly with certain male members of his retinue, whereas Paul, on the other hand, was completely in the other direction. He was forbidding these pleasures, and this was part of his way of exerting authority over people. So there's that corruption of the religion of Jesus through asceticism, but of course asceticism being the antithesis of utilitarianism, Bentham also sees it as a corruption of morality. And his real concern, I would say, is that because the religion of Paul has infected, as he sees it, Christianity, that what's actually been taught and taught in the Christian schools all the way up to the pulpit is the religion of Paul, and therefore people are being taught these ascetic doctrines rather than the more utilitarian doctrines, perhaps, of Jesus. So I think that's probably one thing that you would need to be aware of when, you know, trying to understand where Bentham's coming from with Paul. There's a lot more evidence as well that Bentham provides of what Paul's true enterprise was. He gives loads of accounts to show that what Paul was interested in was getting money, getting reputation, getting prestige. He provides, I think it's particularly volumes 1 and 2. He spends a lot of time talking about what was really going on with the road to Damascus moment that people are quite familiar with. Paul Paul sees this as Bentham sees this as a kind of, he calls it an outward conversion with no inward conversion. So in other words, Paul hasn't converted to anything really, but he's presenting himself as a convert. Because whereas once he was killing and persecuting Christians for money, Paul had realized that he could actually make more money by taking control of these same Christians and fleecing them. So that's kind of the context of where I'm coming from. I've just decided to concentrate for this paper on two of the main means which Paul employed in terms of his exercising control over those current and prospective followers.
I suppose the conversion on the road to Damascus was presented as a sort of miracle.
Yeah.
And the reporting witness was Paul himself, I suppose. And that's another, isn't it, another aspect that Bentham picks up on, that there are conflicting, it gives conflicting accounts.
Yeah.
So there's it's very much a forensic exercise. It's Bentham acting as a historian, putting his sort of sources in the dock, if you like, and examining them and saying, how credible is this account?
He talks at great length about the different accounts of the conversion. I think he identifies three accounts: one given by the historian, the author of the Acts, and then two accounts given by Paul himself in two very different circumstances. And yeah, I mean, I could have given the whole paper on that, because he goes into a lot of detail about how basically Paul he'd say one thing about the conversion in one account to one audience, and then in his other account, when his circumstances have changed and whatnot, he gives a completely different account. And both of those accounts are contradicted by the account in the Acts as well. He also points out that that Paul makes 4 visits to Jerusalem, and on each one of which he meets various of the apostles. And in none of these meetings with the apostles does Paul actually mention this conversation that he's had with God, whereas you would think that if anyone had spent their afternoon talking with God, they would probably mention that to people who he's wanting to kind of insinuate himself with. So yeah, like you say, it's very forensic. It goes through line by line and extrapolates all sorts of assumptions and inferences that you can take from what's actually presented in the Acts and the Epistles.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I'll bring in David Lieberman now, who's got a question. David, over to you.
Right. I'm adjusting. So, Peter, thank you so much. I found that really illuminating. And as usual, this sense of, oh, my dear, there's a whole set of Bentham or an aspect of Bentham I don't know anything about, and I should. Here's my question, and it's inspired by an argument that Hume makes, and it's not, I think, exclusive to Hume, about the Puritans or the radical sects of the 17th century. And that is that they're the kind of dupes of their own enthusiasm, that they are themselves deluded about the world, but they're sincerely deluded. They're, as it were, victims of their belief as much as the perpetrators of their belief. And so the question that for me emerges is, what's the basis for this imputing to Paul of certain set of motives and purposes? Not simply conclude from the fact that it's nonsense and it contradicts what we know of the material world and causation and so on, that Paul is simply deranged, or that Paul doesn't know what he's talking about, or that Paul sincerely believes the road to Damascus miracle, as opposed to Paul being manipulative, Paul is seeking to increase his power, Paul having an agenda to produce a new religion. That doesn't seem to follow. Those arguments don't seem to follow from the demonstration that the epistles are nonsense, or that we have no reason to endorse the interpretation of these events that Paul himself is promoting.
I think what Bentham would want to, I mean, there are certain aspects of Not Paul But Jesus where you can be led to feel that maybe Bentham, has sort of has an agenda against Paul, and he's maybe using the evidence to support his argument. That would be a cynical, sort of negative way of interpreting what Bentham's doing. But what Bentham would want to say is that he's coming at the text with no preconceptions, and that he's just simply allowing the evidence of the text to speak for itself. So he's saying that for so many years, so many centuries, people have read the text to mean, or have almost assumed that the text mean X, Y, and Z. But when you actually look very closely at the Acts of the Apostles and the epistles, as I say, almost line by line, forensically, it's all there for Bentham, that the true purposes of what Paul's been about is contained in the text. So it's not that he's I think you used the word imputing to Paul or whatever. He would say, Bentham would want to say that he's just extracting from the evidence that Paul has provided, just looking at it, scrutinizing it sort of objectively and fairly, and deciding that what it all actually points to is not a kind of devout, pious, prophet-like, holy father of the church. The evidence points to somebody who's mendacious and insincere, who lies, who's deceives people, who's motivated by money. Like he spends a while, but for example, in the Acts, he points out that Paul was a tent maker, and while tent making would have earned a reasonable amount of money at the time, you see that Paul goes from being a tent maker, and then just a few lines later, he's traveling across the sea with like a retinue of about 50 people. He's got all fineries on, in terms of his clothes. He's got, he seems to be dripping with wealth, and the question presents itself: where does this money come from? Bentham also focuses quite a lot on the fact that quite centrally actually, that there was a communal fund at Jerusalem, where all the Christians who lived in Jerusalem, of which there were about 3,000, basically paid all their money, gave all their money to this fund, or certainly a lot of it. And this fund was managed by the apostles and certain trustees that the apostles appointed, called deacons. And again, Bentham spends page after page showing that it must have been A, very large amount of money, and B, it's impossible that Paul wasn't aware of this money. And again, as Paul insinuates himself into the company of the apostles and the religionists at Jerusalem, and then clearly gets more and more money, more and more staff, etc. Again, the evidence just seems to point to Paul's alternative motives. And anyway, I could give lots of other examples, but as I say, Bentham would want to say that the evidence of the Acts speaks for itself, to show Paul's alternative purposes. Just on the point you made at the start about the dupes, the idea that religionists were dupes, whatever. Bentham says, he says two things actually about religionists and their believing this material. The first thing he says is that, and I think I alluded to it a little bit in the paper, that just because something was believed in the past, that there's no reason for people in this day and age, obviously speaking in the 19th century, in this day and age, to believe in probable events when knowledge and understanding of evidence, etc., has advanced to such a state that there's no reason to do that. But then the second thing he says is that there's almost a paradox in that the more distant and the more distant in terms of time and place these events were, and the more and more incredible they seem, and the more far-fetched the miracles seem, and so on and so forth, people, religionists, are almost inclined to find it more believable, because they use their imagination to sort of fill the gaps. This is what Bentham is saying, that if you present something that's kind of seems 90% accurate, you will notice the 10% that's false. But if you present something that seems 99% completely unbelievable, it can actually be more believable to religionists, because their imagination sort of does the rest of the work. So I think that's certainly something you would want to say about the idea of dupes and why people are believing this stuff.
Right. Well, thank you so much.
Doesn't Bentham, in relation to that, say at one point that the more strongly or the more absurd the proposition is you believe, it proves the greater faith you've got.
Yeah,
it proves that you've got greater faith. Yeah, I mean, I was struck at one point by what you said about, you know, getting people to think for themselves. And there's you know, if we think about what Bentham's doing here, as he does elsewhere, he's sort of saying, here we have this historical account, and you know, addressing himself to Christians, he would say, you know, you read this and you take this as you know, literally true. What I want you to do is to think about your own assumptions, and if you take this as literally true, where this leaves you. And so that's when you start to say, well, if this proposition is true, then here's one which contradicts it. They both can't be true. So, you know, draw your own conclusion from that. And this is, I think, typical Bentham argument, and certainly in his writings on religion, or rather, not his argument, but his approach to say, okay, let's put ourselves in your position and see what follows from that. And surely you've got to recognise the absurdities. You know, you as people in every other aspect of your life will follow the best scientific evidence as to, you know, cause and effect, let's say. But when it comes to religion, you ignore all that. I mean, you think that's a fair description of what Bentham's doing?
Yeah, I think so. I think when he's talking about
I have to say that, of course, don't you?
Yeah, of course I do. Yeah. But I think when he's talking about the rule of greatest probabilities, he calls it, and as I said, it's only in the context of the direct miracles he uses that phrase, but the general gist of that rule occurs throughout not Paul but Jesus, and he does make the point that in all other fields of science and thinking, and he lists them all, you know, in science and in maths and whatever else, there is this common sense, as he calls it, mode of thinking, where you rely on your perceptions and your observations and your experience and so on and so forth. But somehow, when it comes to religion, these central tenets of the guide how you think 24/7 just seem to fly out of the window. And yeah, he does call that into question, and he actually says that not only are they abandoned in religion, but of all the particular fields, you know, if they're going to be adhered to in any of the fields, then religion is surely the most important one to stick to these principles, because there's the most at stake. If any of this stuff is correct and you're going to be spending the eternity in either everlasting misery and pain or in ecstasy, then you really should think about it a bit more precise.
Well, that's like, yeah, I mean, that's exactly another example, isn't it? Saying you believe that this is the most important thing because it concerns your eternal well-being. So given it's so important to you, well, of course, Bentham himself, so he tells us, didn't believe that. Anyone else out there with questions or comments? Yes, Tim.
Hello. Hello, Peter.
Hello.
That was great. Thank you very much. It's just a quick one, and I don't know whether there is, but do you see any worth in drawing comparisons between Paul's fallacies and those that Bentham identifies in the Book of Fallacies about politicians? Because the way you describe Paul, he's very much the politician whose ambitions of prestige and power and patronage. And is he, as well as the critique of religion, is he also viewing Paul through that prism, do you think?
The first thing I should say is I probably should familiarise myself a bit more with the Book of Fallacies to answer that question properly. But what I would say is that I really do think that he looks at Paul as very much a analogous or a representation, if you like, of how he views the clergy and the ecclesiastical establishment. When you look at the criticisms he makes in Church of Englandism and the various other things he says about the clergy, about them being sort of rapacious in their desire for privilege and money and prestige, and the fact that they will inculcate habits of insincerity and mendacity in religionists, and various other criticisms he makes of the clergy, the more or less the same kind of criticisms he makes of Paul. So where Paul is using nonsense and quasi-miracles, the clergy are using the catechism and what he calls the literary works of the church to inculcate similar kind of things. And I mean, of course, he sees the catechism as being based on Paul's teachings anyway. So I would say that, yeah, Paul is kind of I can't think of the right word, but a representation of how he views the ecclesiastical class and probably the ruling few more generally.
Thank you. That's grand. Cheers.
But I suppose the one other thing you could, sort of an interesting thing to add to that, is that until he actually criticizes Jesus and the teachings of Jesus and so on and so forth in the Juggernaut material, he will use the teachings of Jesus almost to support his own argument. So, you know, as I said before, he will cite Jesus as some kind of utilitarian. So the interesting thing to note there is that if he's putting Paul and the ecclesiastical class on one side, he's effectively putting himself on the same side as Jesus, at least until the point where he actually attacks Jesus. Just leaving that to one side, he sort of co-opts Jesus to support his own argument as against the clergy and Paul. I think that's quite an interesting angle that certainly I'm kind of looking at in my thesis.
Yeah, there's a question from Ram on the chat, Peter. Ram says, does Bentham offer arguments about how far the religion of Jesus conforms to the principle of utility compared to the religion of Paul? And secondly, does he suggest that if people were to embrace the religion of Jesus instead of Paul's, that they would be more likely to act in accordance with the principle of utility, say, because they'd be less prone to some of the fallacies found in Paul's work?
Yeah, well, I probably just touched on some of that a little bit with my last comments, but yeah. He would definitely see the religion of Jesus as properly conceived as being an improvement on the religion of Paul. There's no doubt about that. So between the two of them, as I say, he identifies some of the practices of Jesus as being he identifies Jesus as a sort of a gregarious sort of. I mean, it's difficult because he does go on to attack Jesus, but for the purposes of this question, he does identify some of the more utilitarian aspects of Jesus, and uses those sort of more favourably as against Paul, and suggests that if you live the way that Jesus taught, and you look at some of the doctrines of Jesus, and you look at the way Jesus lived his life, that was more utilitarian. However, he wouldn't go as far to say to just embrace Christianity as it should be, because obviously he then later on, after he's dealt with Paul, he then goes to attack Christianity on certain other grounds, and all the while, what he's doing when he's attacking the establishment of religion, the clergy, he's attacking St. Paul, he's then attacking Jesus, and then he's identifying what should be put in place of these things, and all the while he's essentially, to my mind, he's essentially brushing religion away and replacing it with the contents that you would find in an introduction to the principles of morals and legislation, so that if you just think for yourself and are guided by utility, then that's the way that you will live the moral and the happy and so on and so forth life. But he's just doing it in stages. But yeah, I mean, the short answer is that he definitely would see Jesus as an improvement on Paul, but not an end in itself.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, Yasunori, he might have a problem with his mic, but can you speak? I'm trying to bring in Professor Fukugai, but we can't hear anything. No. The last no. If you could write it in something in the chat, then we can at least see it. The problems of online seminars. I don't know what time of morning it is in Japan, but I'm very impressed that you're listening in, Yasunori. I mean, this is probably an unfair question, Peter, but because in the sense that I know we've talked about it before, and I've never been able to figure it out. I don't know if you've got any further yet, but have you got any sense of where this fits into the history of biblical criticism?
No, I don't.
Well, fair enough.
No, I haven't managed to establish anything more concrete on that now.
Because most of this stuff was written in the 1810s, and so it's very early in that, as far as I can gather, in that respect.
Yeah, I think you'd noted that there'd been some biblical criticism in Germany, perhaps earlier than this. I think that's what you say in one of your papers.
Yeah, I mean, it emerges around this time in Germany. Of course, Bentham doesn't know anything about that, and he's sort of saying, let's treat these as historical texts, and look at the evidence they give us for the events they purport to describe. I don't think we're going to get anything from Yasunori. So, are there any other questions anywhere? No. Here we are. Well done, thank you. Can you see it, Peter? But I'll read it out in case people can't.
Yeah.
Peter mentioned the earthquake. Is it your explanation of the idea of Bentham or Bentham himself who talked about the earthquake? So Yasunori says he's in Japan, and so earthquakes are usual. However, earthquakes might be very rare in 18th century except that of the famous one in Lisbon. Did Bentham have the real experience of an earthquake? I don't think he did.
No.
He
must have known what an earthquake was to be able to talk sensibly about it. But
the Lisbon earthquake was very famous, of course.
Yeah. No, he gave. I think, as I said in the paper, there were 12 directly stated miracles, and obviously I didn't talk about all of them. I just picked the ones, to be honest, where there was quite a humorous turn of phrase, and when he's pulling apart the miracle stories, Bentham's often quite sarcastic or quite dry in how he does that. And I just like the reference to the miracle story was that Paul and some of his companions had escaped from this prison after an earthquake had struck. But what had happened was the earthquake had left the building and everything intact, but the fetters and the shackles are supposed to have fallen off Paul and his companions. They walked free from the jail. And Bentham is just looking at that again forensically and thinking, well, that's just not how an earthquake would work. So again, he must know what they are, but that's not how they would work. That the shackles and the handcuffs wouldn't just fall away and you walk out. The building would collapse or nothing. So I just like the slightly sarcastic phrases where he's comparing the earthquake to like a pickpocket, a picklock, who's just gone into the building and has sort of very carefully prized open these locks and stuff, which is what you would have to believe that this miracle happened. And he's saying, of course, that's just not how an earthquake would work. So it seems that's one reason to doubt the story. And of course, there were several others, but I think that's the only point of the earthquake appearing in this. It was just some of the nice language that Bentham used to describe it, really.
Some of what you said is so influential still amongst some people. It's what my wife calls parking space theology, where somebody says, "Oh, I prayed for a parking space, and when I got to the shopping centre, there was one. The Lord provided me with a parking space." So a perfectly natural incident that happens to be a space, and you then attribute it to God looking favourably on you, and you say, "I was moved by the Spirit," and to do something, and that sort of is a way of giving it more legitimacy, let's say. It's not that you decided to do this, but God told you to do it, and because you're doing it on the orders of God, it's therefore somehow has more legitimacy, more value, or it's the right thing to do. And Bentham's onto that, isn't he? And he finds it in that it comes from the Bible.
Bentham can ask God to summon up an earthquake on a whim to get him out of a prison. You would wonder why he was in the prison in the first place.
You mean Paul? Yeah, he said Bentham.
Oh, sorry, Paul. Yeah, Paul.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Anyway, I think unless there are any further questions, let's close there. But another point I must bring in, as I always do, is on these occasions, is Monty Python's Life of Brian. And if anyone's not seen it, then they really should, because it encapsulates so many of Bentham's points. And just to give one, there's the hermit who lives in a hole, who's not who's kept silent for 20 years, and Brian comes running along and jumps in and lands on his foot, and the man shouts out and curses, and then when the crowd arrives, he says, "I've not spoken for 20 years until this guy came along," and all the crowd start going, "It's a miracle, it's a miracle." So there we are. That's a natural, if you like, incident transformed into a miraculous one by the subjectivity of the observer, which was the point you made at the beginning of your talk, I think. So anyway, thanks very much, Peter. It's been a really excellent session, very enjoyable. I'm sure we can't give you a clap, but I'm sure we give you a metaphorical one anyway. And finally, just to remind people, we've got David Lieberman in 2 weeks' time talking on courts and democracy in Bentham's mature constitutional thought. So we shall look forward very much to that and hope you can all join us. So finally, once again, just say thank you so much, Peter, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Right, take care, everyone. Good night.